Welcome to the film analysis. Today with Kung Fu Panda Part 4 by Mike Mitchell. We are dealing with an anti-Dune film. But before we get to that, we first need to talk about Thomas Mann's famous novella Mario and the Magician. It features a family coming to Italy and experiencing a strange magic show. The magician and hypnotist Cipolla performs his tricks and delights the audience. It is a parable. Thomas Mann is telling the story of the rise of fascism, and the novella says about the audience, and yet it was clear that this hunchback was not a magician, at least not in the sense of skill, and that this was not for children at all. Again, I don't know what the audience thought. This or that of the interviewees may well have answered from within themselves. Overall, however, it was clear that Cipolla had chosen his people and that the process had been under his control with the aim of achieving the predetermined result, whereby his mathematical acumen was still admirable, even if the others strangely eluded admiration, plus the patriotism and the irritable dignity. End of quote. This Cipolla will first perform a few magic tricks, later he will hypnotize people, make them dance, take away their freedom of will. What does this have to do with Kung Fu Panda? In Kung Fu Panda, the fourth part is very much about magic. It's about not just protecting the people but leading them, giving them spirituality. Cipolla, we are told here, expresses himself on stage as he understands domination and obedience. Mann continues, the ability, he said, to divest someone of oneself, to become a tool, to obey in the most unconditional and perfect sense, is only the flip side of that other ability to will and to command. Commanding and obeying are one and the same ability. Together they form only one principle, an indissoluble unity. He who knows how to obey also knows how to command, and vice versa. The one thought is included in the other, just as the people and the leader are included in each other. But the achievement, the extremely rigorous and exhausting achievement, is in any case that of the leader and organizer, in whom the will becomes obedient, the will to obey. We recognize the fascist ideology, but all Kung Fu Panda films concern obedience, the exercise of power. One person wants and the others follow. They just come across as much funnier and not as threatening as Cipolla in Thomas Mann's novella. But the Kung Fu Panda films also pose the same question as the narrator. What audience is this made for? It's not really for children at all, says the narrator when he sees these magic pieces. Something similar applies to Kung Fu Panda Part 4. When Thomas Mann talks about obedience, we still have a very clear picture. But if we look at the film and how it demands obedience from the audience, this hypnosis happens in a different way, namely through what the essayist and jazz musician Ted Dwyer calls dopamine culture. People are hypnotized into complying, into thinking these images are great, into not questioning the film critically, and at some point everyone claps and applauds. Just like in the novella. Mann writes, Cipolla's triumph at his height, the staff of Circe, this whistling leather whip with a clown grip. So he has a whip with which he constantly frightens and excites everyone, just like Po the panda has a staff of wisdom with which he can do magic things. Mann continues to write, the staff of Circe ruled unrestrained at the time I have in mind, which must have been quite far after midnight. On the small stage danced 8 or 10 people, but there was also a lot of movement in the hall itself. End of quote. This leader managed to move everyone, to dominate everyone. The film doesn't result in having conscious, reflective viewers, but overstimulated, overwhelmed, hypnotized viewers, whether old or young. However, there is an irony in Kung Fu Panda, at least in the first three parts. In the fourth part, the irony wears off and a new task awaits Po, and he must face it with a certain seriousness. And so he must rehearse stupid wisdoms. One explains change doesn't always have to be a bad thing. Why do I always change the menu in the restaurant? Because sooner or later things would lose their flavor if they always stayed the same. And such life advice is transformed into a spiritual philosophy that must be followed. Po is then supposed to be the one who produced such sayings repeatedly for the people in the valley. In the end, Po becomes the preacher of an Instagram tile spirituality. At the beginning of the film, Po, who takes on the role of the Dragon Warrior, initially helps his fathers to open restaurants. However, Master Shifu appears and has news. Po is no longer to be a Dragon Warrior, but is to become the spiritual leader of the entire valley. Po is a little taken aback at first and is not thrilled by this idea, as he is also the one who is to find a successor, a new Dragon Warrior. We experience a dichotomy here. On one side there is the new Dragon Warrior, and on the other side the spiritual leader of the valley. The animals in the valley must be controlled somehow, and the best way is an external threat. Tai Lung, Po's opponent from previous adventures, seems to have returned. As a Dragon Warrior, Po is the commander and he subdues the people. But he is not too different from the presidents in democracies, who ultimately have the power of command. In all of this, Po is what you might call a charismatic leader. And if we look up what charisma means in economy and society by the sociologist Max Weber, we find out charisma is said to be a quality of a personality originally regarded as extraordinary in prophets as well as in therapists and legal practitioners, as well as in hunting guides and war heroes, for the sake of which it is regarded as endowed with supernatural or superhuman, or at least specifically extraordinary powers or qualities not accessible to everyone else, or as sent by God, or as exemplary and therefore as a leader. How the quality in question is to be objectively assessed from any ethical, aesthetic or other point of view is, of course, conceptually completely irrelevant. The only thing that matters is how it is evaluated by the charismatic ruled ones, the followers. End of quote. And you can notice that very well by going into this film with a certain attitude of defiance, and with this defiant attitude you will find this whole idea of domination stupid. Then you won't be captured by this film and its charisma. This charismatic domination that Po has exercised since the first film, it may have changed a little towards a new seriousness, but in general he is still the clumsy fool who somehow falls on his feet by accident every time he falls. But now we learn that this external threat doesn't stem from Tai Lung, but from a chameleon capable of transforming into all kinds of terrifying creatures. The fox Shen explains this to us. And this fox will also prove to be a successor, a possible dragon warrior, during the film. But the chameleon is after Po's Staff of Wisdom, as it carries magical powers, which is exactly what charismatic leadership entails. Who is the chameleon? Well, It's a fascist ruler who comes across as very colorful, and that's a pretty good image for the rising fascism everywhere. This fascism doesn't always just wear the hairstyles of the Hitler youth. It also appears in blonde, strict women's business outfits, or we see reality TV clowns or mildly smiling gurus also spreading fascist ideologies. Parts 1 and 2 still strongly evoke the post-democratic leader, the post-democratic type of leader like Berlusconi came to mind, or you could also say that the two films anticipated Trump, but charismatic rule was already characterized quite well in the first part by talking about a pasta dish that supposedly had a secret ingredient until it turned out that this secret ingredient was nothing. And that is exactly what charisma means. Charisma is everything and nothing. It is everything for the followers, it is nothing for the outsiders. Charisma cannot be grasped. It's the je ne sais quoi, the I don't know what. Now, the search for a successor is not about looking for any competences that you can rationally justify, but Master Shifu tells Po, you will recognize him when you see him. Here we also have a charismatic selection. It is only about being chosen, and that puts us in the sphere of what Max Weber calls hierocracy. Hierocracy, a priestly rule, seems at first unusual for a modern capitalist society. Weber also writes, the development of modern bourgeois democracy and capitalism has substantially shifted the conditions of hierocratic rule, at first apparently consistently to its disadvantage. Capitalism continued its triumphal march against the protest and often the direct resistance of the clergy. Its bearer, the bourgeoisie, increasingly outgrew a historical connection with hierocratic powers in its upper middle classes. Both the hierocratic regulation of life and the reservations of the hierocracy against modern natural science, the bearer of the technical basis of capitalism, as well as the increasing rationalism of life as such, which was becoming ever more transparent and controllable, increasingly turned against the bearers of magical gifts of grace and, above all, against the most inward authoritarian-orientated claims of democracy which supported the traditional authorities. However, end of quote, however, this priesthood changed. Suddenly, such structures were reintroduced into capitalism. Weber writes, for example, attempts were made to create a magical link between the workers and the entrepreneurs so that there would be no revolution. Today, we are living in very technicist societies. At the same time, the belief in miracles is returning. Cold algorithms dominate, but if these algorithms suddenly only flush astrology and some populists into our timelines, we suddenly see how technology and religion can combine and how priestly rule is not at all per se. When we think about this return of magic in the public sphere and in politics, we naturally think of Donald Trump presenting himself as the chosen one to such an extent that he said, if I were to shoot someone in the street, people wouldn't hold it against me. Or Panda also, our Panda also seems charismatic as he appears so foolish. We could see something similar with Boris Johnson or Trump. People identify with the person who does not follow suit, who dares to overstep the boundaries. And in all of this, we are experiencing a film expressing dopamine culture, just as the magician in Thomas Mann's novella is after addicts, those who no longer have free will. We are no longer experiencing Chippola's whip, but we are experiencing this whip through algorithms, through the technical control of the masses. And when we look at how the film is structured, its pace, even if you only have an attention span of 10 seconds, you can keep up, then we know what this is about. We are being whipped into line. We are not supposed to become enlightened subjects. We are supposed to follow. This is an American-Chinese co-production. Part 3 from 2016 was still very much about cooperation. There was no sign of any bloc formation. Here too, we don't see a film that clearly wants to take sides. Instead, it tries to ignore the political tensions and offers something that could appeal to both power blocs. And this is also where the fox, who will appear as the successor to the dragon warrior, comes into play, not acting as clumsily as the panda, but with calculation and rationality. We may also see something like a scientific priesthood here. The slogan, "Listen to the science," can quickly become a dogma. Some reviews suggest a feminist turn, because after all, it all boils down to a female dragon warrior, the fox Zhen. It must be said that the spiritual leader of the entire valley will be Po. We still have male domination, but charismatic leadership and femininity are not mutually exclusive anyway, as Max Weber has already explained. There's a very interesting passage where he says, charismatic rule as the extra everyday is abruptly opposed to both rational, especially bureaucratic, and traditional, especially patriarchal and patrimonial or estate-based rule. Both are specifically everyday forms of rule. The genuinely charismatic one is specifically the opposite. Kung Fu Panda 4 represents the counterfilm to Dune Part 2. In Dune, Denis Villeneuve first tells us a hero's journey and plays with our expectations. And then he throws a spanner in the works. He negates the idea of being a leader. He doesn't want to tempt us and everyone in the film to follow just one leader at the end. At last, we are already somewhat immune to this fanatical cult of leadership. Kung Fu Panda 4 concerns the very opposite. Here a leader figure is established, or rather one figure replaces the other. While Po becomes the spiritual leader, he is constantly improving and can now also produce these pseudo-wisdoms, and they are nothing more than ideology for the people in the valley. He resembles the Bene Gesserit in Dune, who produce religion so that the Fremen believe in it. Kung Fu Panda 4 reflects the present. We observe a certain division of labor in autocracies. At the end of the film, we have a spiritual leader and a new dragon warrior who now acts as supreme commander and thus also as ruler of the country. This is something we can see in a similar way when we look at Trump on the one hand and his conspiracy theorists Alex Jones and Tucker Carlson on the other. Or think of the division of labor in Brazil when Bolsonaro was still president. Bolsonaro is effectively the dragon warrior, and on his side is the spiritual leader of the evangelical Pentecostal church, Silas Malafaia, who produced ideology so that the people would vote for Bolsonaro. And in China, it is even more complicated in that President Xi, as the head of the Communist Party, represents reason and science, but at the same time is increasingly referring to Confucianism, and once said that Confucianism is the cultural soil nourishing the Chinese people. Kung Fu Panda 4 represents so an anti-Dune film. Villeneuve questions the hero's journey. He deconstructs charismatic leadership. We want Paul to help the Fremen. Later, Paul becomes a charismatic leader and thus degenerates into someone obsessed with power. However, Kung Fu Panda Part 4 lacks a voice of reason. There is no Shani like in Dune Part 2. The fox Shen is not as hyper as the panda. She is more Machiavellian and predictable, but she becomes the leader who has already changed sides several times when she also served the chameleon, and she was a bandit just as many autocrats have a criminal past. In Kung Fu Panda 4, there are only Pauls and Stilgers, obsessed with power and waging holy wars, fighting against evil, against the shadow realm, against the realm of darkness. And we watch, but don't see. It would be nice if you would like to support the film analysis financially. You can do so via my bank account or PayPal. Also, you can find me on Patreon. Thank you very much.